Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Harvard Extension School's Author Spotlight Series. My name is Jill Felicio, and I am an HES alum, as well as the Director of Advancement for Harvard's Division of Continuing Education. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very special hour with Ted Johnson, ALM class of 2011, who will share with us his motivations, his vision, and biggest takeaways from his latest book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America. Now, as we get underway, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. Please use the Q&A box for any questions that you wish to ask during today's recorded program. Ted will address them later in the hour. Today's video will also be available on HES's YouTube channel just as soon as it is fully captioned. Now, Theodore Ted Johnson is the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work explores the role that race plays in electoral politics, issue framing, and disparities in policy outcomes. Previously, he was a national fellow at New America and a research manager at Deloitte. He is also a retired commander in the U.S. Navy following a 2-decade career that included service as a White House fellow, military professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Ted holds a BS in mathematics from Hampton University, an ALM in international relations from Harvard Extension School, and a doctorate of law and policy from Northeastern University. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal, National Review, Politico, and as of just moments ago, the Harvard Gazette. His debut book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, outlines a path toward a multiracial national solidarity to finally overcome that existential threat of racism in the United States. It was published by Atlantic Monthly Press in June of 2021, and it is our honor to have him here with us today. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks, Jill, so much for having me. It's so good to be here. I do not think that when I left Harvard in 2011 that I would have envisioned returning a decade later to talk about a book that I'd just written. It's incredible. But as I sort of mentioned in the Gazette article that's available today, this Harvard was the beginning of a journey that I couldn't have imagined when I started, but I think the seeds for which were planted there at Harvard, and from in the military, retiring from there, finishing a doctorate, and then now writing this book and thinking really deeply about our country and the role that race has played in its history and continues to play today. All of these things became possible because of the sort of confidence in my abilities and the education that I got at Harvard. So it's great to be here, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the themes in the book. Now, this book is part memoir, it's part academic text around political theory and philosophy and sociology and history, political science, and also part polemic about what I think is the problem in America, what's preventing us from realizing the promise of America, and then what can be done about it and what the way ahead might look like. So instead of trying to pack together family story, 90,000 words of scholarship, and then sort of my opinion in a short period of time, I think I'll just begin with a story that will allow me to unpack some of the ideas in the book, and then I think will be a good place to sort of stop and then lead into Q&A part of this. Okay, so where I want to start is Route 40 in northeastern Maryland. Now, Maryland, of course, sits below the Mason-Dixon line, but the part of Maryland between Baltimore, which is at the northern edge of Maryland, and the state line, there's a rural section of Maryland that looks a lot like the South in terms of culture, the ruralness of it, and the people and the customs, et cetera. And so let's start there, and let's start there in the late 50s, early 60s. Okay, so what's happening in the world at this time is that the United States and the Soviet Union are superpowers, And we are fighting in a Cold War, not actual armaments for the most part, but fighting on the world stage about whether the better way forward for nations is to pursue democracy or to pursue communism. And in the context of this happening, or while this is happening, there's a number of nations in sub-Saharan Africa and other places that are now gaining their independence from other nations that used to that colonized them, whether it was Britain or Spain or France or wherever. And so a lot of these sub-Saharan African nations are getting their independence, and as they gain their independence, they're establishing ambassadors, and they're sending ambassadors to the United Nations in New York City. And those ambassadors, once arriving in New York City, have to go to Washington, D.C. to present their credentials to the State Department, the President of the United States, sort of to formally take their seat as the chief diplomat in our country from their country. One of these African diplomats is a man named Adam Malik Sow. So Adam Malik Sow was from the country that we now call Chad, and he arrived in New York City late 50s, it might have been actually early 60s, 1960, 61 or so. And the custom at the time then wasn't to fly everywhere like we do now, but it was to sort of fly into the United States and then take the train or drive to other places, or the bus even. Ambassadors were being driven from New York to DC. And one of the ways, or one of the more common routes to DC from New York included Route 40. All of it wasn't all interstate all the time, especially given that the interstate was a pretty relatively new creation in the United States in the early 60s. And so Adam Malik Sow, Black man from Chad, and his driver, French speaking, French is their sort of the national language, and then they have their sort of dialects, and then English wasn't the primary language. So they're driving Route 40, rural part of Maryland, still segregated. And that included theaters, dining facilities, schools, etc. It also included the diners that lined Route 40. And so the ambassador from Chad had a headache and wanted to pull over one of these diners to get a cup of coffee, maybe some food. And as he walks into Jim Crow America, an America he was not familiar with, but an America that saw his Black skin and assumed that he was just another Black person that didn't understand exactly what was that was sort of stepping out of line, that was bucking the custom. And so they walk in through his driver, who was his translator. Sal asked for a cup of coffee, and the diner, or the restaurant's owner, the diner's owner, says, "We don't serve N-words here." And there's sort of, as the translation is going back and forth and they're trying to understand what's happening, they're kicked out of the diner and basically told, Black people are not welcome here, whether you're American or otherwise. Now, if this was just a Black guy from Baltimore, it would have been an unremarkable incident in the region. It would have been very remarkable to that Black man, but in the region, this kind of thing was understood. It was what happened every day. But because Sal was an ambassador from a part of the world that the United States and the Soviet Union were fighting over for influence, when Sal shows up to present his credentials to the State Department, he tells the representative there about his experience in Northern Maryland. And the representative at the State Department says, when you meet with John F. Kennedy, the president, you need to tell him what happened. And as it turns out, Sal does the same, and the State Department collects a number of stories from different African ambassadors who had all been discriminated against on Route 40 in Maryland because of the color of their skin. So John F. Kennedy realizes what's happening here. This is bad for American security. This is bad for American foreign policy. As we are telling the world that democracy is the way forward, as we are telling the world that we are the nation of democracy and freedom and liberty and equality, we are discriminating against people from the world who are Black. We're discriminating against American citizens who are Black. And the Soviets, every time we get on our high horse about equality, say, and you lynch Black people, you lynch Negroes, as if to say, this is a nation that lies about what it believes in. It lies about what democracy is. And as a counter argument suggests that perhaps communism might be the better way forward. This is, of course, something that the United States government couldn't have. And so Kennedy, The State Department, they reach out to the governor of Maryland, the state assembly. They send representatives to the diners along Route 40, all to try to convince these diner owners and the Maryland state government to outlaw segregation, at least on this strip of real estate, so that we don't harm American national security and foreign policy interests by practicing racism on the very nations that we need to ensure our stability and our ability to compete with the Soviet Union on the world stage. And when a Life magazine reporter walked into the diner where the ambassador had been refused a cup of coffee and asked the diner's owner, a woman who they only described as Mrs. Leroy Merritt, asked her, why didn't you, serve this ambassador? And she responded, how was I supposed to know he was an ambassador? He looked just like another run-of-the-mill N-word to me. And they were not thinking about American foreign policy. In fact, when the State Department showed up, they told them, I serve truck drivers at my stop, truck drivers who are white and don't want to eat alongside Black people. If I help you guys out by integrating my restaurant, I lose all of my white customers. So this isn't a racism thing for me. This is a livelihood thing. This is an economic decision. Long story short, ultimately, these diners did desegregate their restaurants only for African ambassadors. If you were an African ambassador, you could now eat in these diners. And in fact, many of them would usher you to a private dining room for two reasons. One, to make you feel special, and two, so that the white patrons of the restaurant didn't have to watch you or feel like they're sitting beside you when they're, as if there was some racial equality in this place while they were dining. Another thing happens is that if you were a Black American who had heard, oh, they've desegregated the diners on Route 40 and decided to go eat there, you were still kicked out. And this is one of the central ideas in the book, that whenever the United States realizes racial progress, it's not because there's been a wave of moral epiphanies about the humanity and dignity of people who have been marginalized. Instead, it's because it's in the nation's interest to make its democracy a little bit more inclusive of those that used to exclude, in order to achieve some other national security, foreign policy, economic interest unrelated to the practice of racism in an interpersonal manner. And this is how the United States could justify going to bat for African ambassadors to be treated as equals on Route 40, and leaving behind Black Americans who have served in all of our nation's wars, and saying that the integration of these facilities did not extend to Black Americans, or that the government wouldn't demand that Black Americans were included in this compromise because it wasn't in the nation's interest to do so at the time. Shortly thereafter, 2, 3, 4 years later, eventually those restaurants did all desegregate, but that's because of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, and basically the nation changed. And so the nation changed for African ambassadors before it changed for Black Americans, because it was in the national security interest and the foreign policy interest for the change to happen to include Black people from Africa and to exclude Black people from America. So what does this all mean, and sort of how do I connect this? This is one of the many stories I tell in the book, but how does it connect to the broader thesis of the book? It does so in this way. Progress in our country is not accomplished because we have succeeded in convincing people who see the world differently from us to see the moral, ethical case that we are making and compel them to change their behavior. Instead, on the question of racism, the country changes when those who are making moral, ethical, and principled demands for equality are able to marry those demands for equality with a national interest. This may feel a little bit yucky to say, or to think or believe, but it's true that nation states don't move strictly because something is the morally correct thing to do. They move because it's in their interest to do so. And if you don't believe me, Ted Johnson in 2021, then let's see what the founders of our country said about it. In 1776, all the way through 1787, when in the time period between the Declaration of Independence being signed and the ratification of the Constitution following the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the founders determined that our nation would be a nation where all men are created equal, where all of us have these unalienable rights to that, and among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government will derive its just powers from the consent of the governed, and that we will enslave people as we create this country of equality. And they made that compromise because it was in the interest of the creation of the Union to do so. If those who were abolitionists, those founders of the nation who did not believe that slavery should be a part of it, if they had insisted on abolishing slavery, then the United States, as we know it today, would not have come together. There would have been separate countries right along each other's borders, but the southern colonies whose economies were dependent on slave labor, and the northern economies, which were less dependent on it, would not have come together to create the Union. And what the framers of our nation, the founders, determined was that the Union was more important than getting rid of slavery, that creating a nation on the idea of equality was more important than actually extending that equality to all of the people in the nation, to include Native Americans, to include enslaved Black people, and to include white immigrants from Ireland, from parts of Italy, from Poland, who were not considered to be on par with sort of the white colonists as they described themselves at the time. And then 90 years later, when we go to civil war, and the nation breaks in half, literally separates in two over the question of slavery. The nation then determines, with the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, that the only way for the Union to persist is for slavery to be abolished. And so a civil war is waged, 1 million casualties occur during this civil war in order to abolish slavery, in order to, frankly, reunify the country and abolish slavery. Okay, so in a 90-year span, we have a nation that insisted on slavery sticking around to create the Union. And then we have a nation that insisted on going to civil war to abolish slavery to save the Union. In this 90-year span, these two very different actions in opposite directions on the question of slavery, nothing about slavery got worse. Nothing got more evil. Nothing got more tragic or horrific about the institution of slavery. But the nation's interests changed. It was in the interest to create the Union in 1776, and it was in the interest of the nation to preserve the Union or reunify the country in 1860 to 65. And that's why we took opposite positions on the question of slavery, though nothing about the institution had changed. Okay, so let's move forward to today. And frankly, let's talk about the big picture argument in the book. The book argues that racism is an existential threat to America, okay? And by this, I mean, not that if white people and people of color don't get along together, there will be another civil war which will break the nation in two. No, what the argument is that structural racism is an existential threat to the American idea. Not the United States. The United States has shown that it can live comfortably with racism sometimes. Jim Crow, Native American dispossession of land and killing and chattel slavery. So the United States, the geopolitical entity, the nation state, can live with racial inequality. The idea of America, the promise of America, that we're all created equal, that we all have these unalienable rights, that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, those ideas cannot live alongside structural racism. And so either we decide we want to be more American, live closer to our ideals, and then we combat racism, or racism expands, and now the ideals of America begin to diminish. And the two things cannot coexist. Whenever one recedes, the other one surges forward. And so if they can't coexist, then one is an existential threat to the other. And so structural racism, and by this I mean the duties of the state to ensure a level playing field, to ensure equal protection under the law, et cetera, is racism presents a threat to those ideas. The second big idea here, or part of the thesis, is that if structural racism is an existential threat to the American ideals, then multiracial solidarity is the only thing that can compel the public to force the nation to do something about this threat. Multiracial solidarity, that means that we come across lines of difference in race and ethnicity, custom, culture, language, religion, nation of origin, all of these different, these things that region, these things that make us different and diverse, that we come together not because we want lower taxes or not because we want cleaner air, but we come together because we recognize that the nation is not delivering on its promise to us. The promise is that we're created equal, that will be equal protection under the law, that we have unalienable rights, okay, that government derives its power from us. And when government doesn't do that and allows racial inequality to persist, then it's the government's job to fix the structures that lead to this inequality. And if it doesn't, it's incumbent upon us, we the people, to compel the government to do so. The only way we will ever come together to do that is if we do this across racial lines, especially given our nation's history. And those with power know this. And so the way to break a multiracial coalition is to pull at the racial tensions in the nation, to exploit racial differences, and turn us against one another. And so it is convenient and politically expedient for us to, for the nation to only talk about racism as a thing white people do to people of color, to only talk about racism as the inability of Black and white people to get along. That is not the kind of racism that is plaguing the country. And when people say that structural racism is a problem in America, they're not talking about the hearts of white people. The argument instead is that our nation is structured historically on a set of policies and ideas and laws that have created a nation that makes it more difficult for people of color who are similarly situated to a white American to achieve the same thing with, even if they have the same education, the same work ethic, the same social economic status, et cetera. And multiracial solidarity demands the state do something about that inequality it's producing. The third part of the argument and final part of this three-legged stool is that if we want to learn how to create multiracial solidarity, especially when it's so convenient for those with power to just pull at the racial threads and make us fight one another instead of working together, then we can look at the historical experiences of Black America to determine what the attributes of that solidarity might look like. We all know that every time there's a congressional and presidential election, that 90% plus of Black voters are likely going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And it's not because Black people all love Democrats. We are just as politically diverse, ideologically diverse as every other race and ethnicity. But it's because there is, given the Black experience in America, we have learned that the group interest should supersede self-interest if any one of us wants to realize the American promise, which is to say, if you live in a nation where there is slavery, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how well dressed or how well your diction is or any of that, because the group you belong to is enslaved, you are enslaved. If we live under Jim Crow, it doesn't matter how much of a Christian you are, or it doesn't matter how hardworking you are, and it doesn't matter how patriotic you are. In Jim Crow, if you were Black, then you were part of you were subjected to the discrimination that Jim Crow permitted. And so now your individual characteristics and traits and beliefs didn't allow you to embrace Americanism because the group persecution prevented it. And so the idea of Black solidarity in America is that the only way that I can ever hope to be treated as an individual is when the nation recognizes my group as being truly and fully American. And so until that day comes, the group interest has to supersede my self-interest. Okay, and then the book sort of describes some of these attributes, and these are attributes, frankly, I think every American, no matter their race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or nation of origin, all of us should adopt these things, and we can talk about what some of these things are. The point here, though, isn't that Black Americans exclusively hold the answer to the future. It is that every group that's ever been marginalized in this country, women, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, white immigrants from certain countries, immigrants from Southeast Asia, you name it. If you've ever been excluded from the fullness of democracy, then your American story, or the story of your group in America, is a story of activism and demands for inclusion in our democracy. And that fight for inclusion is the fight to make America live up to its ideals, its principles. And every group has this story. Every group has these traits and attributes. And this book is about the contribution that Black Americans make to America, to our country. Okay, 3 quick points, and then I'll sort of wrap up here. So if the argument is racism is an existential threat to America, and that multiracial national solidarity is the remedy to the threat, and that Black America holds a set of lessons to this, that alone isn't sufficient for us to sort of skip happily ever after into the sunset. There are other conditions that must be met. One of them is that we have to think about the fulfillment of the American promise as color conscious and not colorblind. And this might be controversial, but the idea that Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which says, where he says that he dreamed of a place where his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, people often assume that what he was saying was, I want an America where color doesn't matter, an America where color, where that is colorblind, where race doesn't matter. And what he was actually saying is, he wasn't saying that he didn't want his children to be Black anymore. He was saying that I want my children who are Black to be treated as fully and truly American, not for their Blackness to be of no consequence, because there is a history, a culture, a pride in one's group and their identity. Why should we get rid of that? We shouldn't subsume other parts of our identity just to cling to a national one that wipes away the stories of how we became American. And so what he was saying is, I want a nation that sees my children as Black and loves them anyway, not for a nation that doesn't see my children as Black, all right? And so in order for our country to fulfill its principles, to live up to its principles, we have to recognize the histories of the people that are here, and then address our public policy, the way we structure our society has to factor in those different experiences. That's what I mean by color conscious, not quotas, not set asides, but a way of thinking that accounts for our different paths in America. The second is that racism is a crime of the state. Too often, as I mentioned, whether it's 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion, which was a multiracial coalition that basically sought to overthrow the King's government in Virginia, or the postal strike of 1970, where postal workers went on strike, and the way they broke the strike was basically cleaving at racial tensions within the strike. This has been the tactic that has always been employed by those who hold power that don't want to give it up. When a multiracial coalition comes together, they go to the white members of the group, the Hispanic members of the group, Native Americans of the group, Black people of the group, Asian Americans of the group, and make different appeals in hopes of breaking the multiracial solidarity and then delivering more to some parts of the group and less to others, because in the net, they end up having to give up less. Okay, so that is, so if racism, it should not be a bickering between us, then structural racism is actually a responsibility of the state to address. And all of us will benefit when structural racism is conceived of as a crime of the state and not a thing that people do to one another. All right, even though certainly there are racist people with sort of hatred in their hearts and prejudiced people of all races that do things to one another on an interpersonal basis, that's not what I'm talking about. The structural racism is the kind that that can transform the country to be closer to what we want it to be. And the third is, if the only thing that ever unites us, that unites all Americans, 330 million plus of us, that frankly, there is no one thing. We are different races, different ethnicities, religions, customs, cultures, languages, et cetera, all the differences I've named. And frankly, at the founding of the country in Federalist Paper number 2, Alexander Hamilton said, hey, folks, colonies, you can ratify this Constitution because we're all one people. We speak the same language. We worship the same God. We're born of the same customs and cultures, and we fought aside one another in this Revolutionary War. So we're not different people. There actually is such a thing as an American, and we're all the same. Of course, that wasn't true in 1787, 1788, and it certainly is less true today. And we don't need to make it true in order for this nation to work. And so what is the thing that unites us if we are really a disparate people from disparate places and disparate beliefs? Well, I think it is a civil religion. And this is an idea that is as old as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and was sort of reimagined in the late 60s by a sociologist named Robert Bellah, and basically says that there is a kind of religious way to participate in American society. All the tenets of religion, they have their canons and scriptures, they have their pantheons, deities, disciples, they've got their rituals and observances and holidays, and they've got like all the markings of a traditional religion. If you look at American life, we have those too. We've got our canons, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. We've got our deities and pantheon, George Washington and Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Frederick Douglass. We've got our rituals, this national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance. We've got our observances, the Independence Day, Memorial Day. We've got our symbols, the Statue of Liberty. It's not the cross, it's not the crescent moon or the Star of David, but it's the Statue of Liberty. It's the American flag. And so all the markings of religion, not a particular religion, but of any religion, also exist in civic life. And I think that clinging to these kinds of belief systems, the principles on which the nation was founded is the thing that unites us all. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here, but I want to conclude by telling you about where the name of the book comes from. When the Stars begin to Fall is a verse out of what the renowned historian, sociologist, and Harvard graduate W.E.B. Du Bois wrote. He called one of the sorrow songs of America. He wrote this in his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. And these are songs that enslaved Black people sung in order to express both their dissatisfaction with their state, their life in America, but also their hope and optimism that tomorrow would be better. When the Stars Begin to Fall was one of the songs that they sung. Was supposed to be about, in Christian theology, about the rapture, when all believers or their souls ascend to heaven, where they live in peace and joy forever. But what it was actually about were enslaved Black people singing for emancipation, singing for freedom, singing for liberty and the ability to be considered a fully true American. And they couldn't sing about that while they were enslaved because they were forbidden to do so by those who enslaved them. And so they cloaked their desire, their heart's desire for freedom, in Christian themes. And so when the stars begin to fall, a new day comes, our souls ascend, and we live in peace and joy forever, is really a song about the day when freedom and liberty is extended to those the nation marginalizes, so that they can be considered truly American and enjoy the full rights and privileges of citizenship. It also means that we have a choice about the kind of nation we're going to leave to posterity. Will we leave a nation that is another step closer to being the more perfect union? Or will we leave behind a nation to the next generation that has not yet managed to figure out its issues with racism, that excuses discrimination, that views some of us as less American than others, and leaves this fight to our children and our children's children to fight? So when the stars begin to fall means that at this decision point that me and you have right now, will the stars fall into place because we've finally figured out how to create a multiracial democracy? Or will the stars fall out of the sky because maybe it turns out that we aren't up to the task to create a kind of nation that the world has never seen before? So this is both a story of hope and optimism from my family's journey from slavery all the way through to my time working in the Obama administration. And it's a story grounded in history and political philosophy and sociological theory. And it's a story of America and who we are, who we profess to be, and can we close the gap between who we want to be and who we have been. And so I think with that, maybe I'll take a breath here and look forward to some of the conversation.
Great, thank you so much for that background. And as someone noted in chat, very clear-eyed perspective on how we move forward from what feels at times like such a desperate period in history. I just want to go back a little bit to your civil religion. We have a great question, that I feel is very relevant to that. And what is the role of education in making our nation better and reducing discrimination and racism, in the heart of the times where critical race theory is being objected? And what are your thoughts on that? Your book is so hopeful. Your book extends this promise and this unification of vision. Does education lie at the core?
It does. It absolutely does, for a few reasons. One, an informed and educated public is better capable of holding their government to account for the things it is or isn't doing. Two, because public school is really the place where we are socialized into American culture. And so that's where we meet people who are different than us. That's where we learn about the world around us and we learn about each other. And so it's education is central to both a functioning democracy and our ability to function in that democracy. But as we're seeing with this debates over critical race theory, over the 1619 Project, this actually is another way of proving a point I made earlier, sort of in my lead up here, that instead of talking about what critical race theory is, instead of having a more nuanced and honest discussion about the nation's history, the conversation around these two things is, this group of people say that white people are racist, or this group of people say that Black suffering, for example, Native American suffering, should not be part of the story we tell children about America, because maybe these children won't love America if they really knew it, or if they learned to hate America because of the way we teach about our shortcomings. Both sides are presenting a fraction of the argument, and they are polarizing the public in the process. And it's happening in our school systems. So the very place where we kind of learn socially how to become American and how to be American is now a battleground on racial lines about which side loves the country more, and about which story of America is the one that is the defining one. So education is central, but it is also a battleground and is a tool that's been used to turn us against one another, instead of being a place where we can all learn about each other and then recognize the fullness of the American story. In the back of the book, I make 5 recommendations. If you guys ever write a book, let me forewarn you that at the back of the book, in the last chapter, your publisher is going to tell you the same thing they told me, which is, you can't leave people with just sort of big ideas. You have to tell them what to do. You have to give them concrete things. And so I have 5 concrete things that need to happen for this solidarity I'm talking about to occur. One is democracy reform of our institutions, which we can talk about if you guys would like. One is deliberative democracy, or how we, the lack of deliberation presently, and how we talk about issues and the need to force that deliberation, especially at the local level. The role of national service and incentivizing people to want to serve the country or their communities in various ways alongside other Americans who are different from them. The necessity of transformative leadership, which we can talk some about. But the 5th one is the question of education. We need a completely revamped way of conceiving civic education in this country. Yes, it's important that in K through 12, we learn that there are 3 branches of government and how Congress works, et cetera, how a bill becomes a bill. But it's even more important that there is a lifelong education around civic learning to teach us how to behave in a democratic society. And by behave, I mean how to participate, how to think critically, how to hold politicians and elected officials to account when they don't do what they're supposed to do or what we've asked them to do. And we don't teach citizens how to do that, how to stay active and participatory in our society in a way that encourages civic engagement and sort of civic virtue and excellence in the way we do it. So education is central, but it is not a silver bullet. Anything that can help us, that can pull us back from the precipice that structural racism is sort of presenting the country, can also be weaponized along racial lines to try and turn us against one another.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, in your discourse on civil education, the importance of including the flaws, including the hypocritical moments in time. I think
Right.
that transparency is so key. There's a great pivot to that, really. Someone in the questions reflect on what strikes me as your reference around white Christian America and who is American. You know, there's this wonderful portion, I think it's like chapter 3, where you get into, you know, what is the myth of American? What does that mean?
Right.
You know, and sort of upending that myth and celebrating, you know, what Black America has achieved and all that they've unified for.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on exactly what it means to be truly American and how we get that narrative turned?
Right. Yeah, it's so Americans conceive of this in 2 ways. One way is one that probably will feel familiar to most of us. When Americans are asked, what is the marking of a good American or of a good citizen? We say things like they pay their taxes, they obey the law, they serve the country, whether it's jury duty or military or in some way. It's sort of like those kinds of big things: pay your taxes, obey the law, engage your community. Those are the things that make you a good American. And then and on the other angle, there was a poll that was put out, it's been a few years ago now, maybe actually a couple of decades, that asked about like what the prototypical American looks like. White Christian was the answer for more than 50% of those who polled. And only 2% of those who polled said that a prototypical American patriot is black. And so when we begin to racialize patriotism, then American, who is truly American, begins to align to the racialization of that patriotism. And this is not something we do intentionally. It's not something we do with malice in our heart. But to your question, it is connected directly to the mythology we tell ourselves about our country. The story goes like this, and this is what we all heard sort of in elementary school, that there are these people who are being persecuted for their religious beliefs and their desire to represent themselves, self-determination, individualism in England, who left and decided we don't want to live like that anymore. We want to live in a country where freedom and liberty and where you can prosper by the sweat of your brow are the guiding principles of a nation. And that those people came over here, they fought a revolutionary war based on these ideals to separate themselves from the crown. And then they set about building a country based on these principles of equality and liberty. And the people who were doing this were all educated, enlightened white men, white Christian men. And so the ideals of the country became entangled with the personification of those ideals, which, if we look at who the great men of the latter 18th century in America were, they're all George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. They all look very similar, right? And so because the origin story of the United States is geared towards suggesting that enlightened white men created this new thing and graciously extended it to those who weren't as fortunate or as capable as they were, that has become the story. And yes, there was slavery. Yes, there was dispossession of Native American land and life. Yes, we didn't allow women to own property or vote until 1920. Yes, there were immigrants who we denied entry to, or we put into status of indentured servitude. Yes, all these things existed, and we call ourselves the nation founded on equality, but those were just basically political calculations or the decisions of some bad apples. But generally speaking, the idea that these brilliant white men came up with is basically the promised land. And now the goal is to get people to recognize the brilliance and ingenuity and assimilate to the customs that these folks built. And that is just not, that's the Disney version, frankly, of the nation. The real version is much uglier, but it's not ugly. There are ugly parts in the nation's history, in the nation's story, but the nation's trajectory, the story of America, is not an ugly story, even if it has ugly bits. And so instead of focusing on the ideals and insisting that our origin is there, or that's the whole of the story, or instead of focusing exclusively on the horrors of our history and insisting that the true character of the nation lies in that horror, let's connect where we began, which is full of both vision and terrible things and horrible things, and the ideals which that we all hope to aspire to, that we all hope to create a nation that can live up to. The distance between those things is the story of America. And our job is to connect the origin to the ideal. And that's what we've been doing for nearly 250 years now. And if we focus on the story of progress, that is an inclusive story, that is a holistic story. It's a story that encounters the ugly parts and the shortfalls, but also embraces the brilliance of the vision of a nation created on the idea that we're all created equal.
That's great. Now, you talk about policy in your book as a way to manage how racism is experienced and expressed, but that no promises, policy, or agenda will be a cure-all, for what racism has wrought.
That's right.
Can you talk about that in the context of today's leadership? There's a great question in chat about what leaders or, contemporary leaders, and you mentioned several leaders over the last century, but are there any today who you see as embodying this return to the vision of multiracial unity?
Wow, that's a really great question. And so the short answer is, I'm sure they exist. I'm sure I've met them. I'm sure I've served in the military with them. I've encountered them, in life.
Mhm.
But oftentimes the heroes of our time are not recognized until after the era has passed. Martin Luther King was, as much as he was respected by presidents and those within the civil rights movement, when he was assassinated, his disapproval rating in the United States was something like 3/4 of American and even more than half of Black people didn't approve of his methods or the evolution of his message, which had sort of moved to poverty and the Vietnam War and away from these sort of basic claims to constitutional rights. So we see Martin Luther King now as like this great man who lived, but the people of his time, especially at the latter part of his life, did not see him the way we do today. That doesn't make him not a hero, but it suggests that if you try to identify heroes in real time, it's really, really difficult. Washington, of course, was an exception, but Lincoln, who we consider the greatest president, was assassinated because of the courage and leadership that we now revere, but that much of the nation at the time, including the former Confederate States, did not appreciate. Okay, so 2 things I want to make, 2 points I want to make here. Okay, so so when it comes to leadership and sort of and the way out of this, and policy in particular, one tangible way of thinking about this is about the wealth gap in America, and we've all heard about the wealth gap. The wealth gap between white and Black American households is like 1,700%, or 1,700%, 17 times more wealth in a white household, median white household, than a Black median household, which is to say, I think the Black median wealth household is like $8,000 or something like that, and for white median households, it's over 100,000. That includes like the value of the equity in one's home. And so a lot of policymakers have said the way to close this wealth gap is with reparations, and maybe not policymakers, activists. And activists have said if we pay reparations, this is a way of closing the wealth gap that was exacerbated because of bad housing policy, like racist housing policy in the 20th century, of the policy of enslavement in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and all of the resulting discriminatory policies, social, economic, et cetera, that emanate from those things. But I want to say this, and this goes back to a core argument in the book. If we were to do reparations tomorrow and close the wealth gap between Black households and white households overnight, if we have not done the harder work of rooting out all of the ways our society is structured that produces racial inequality, then the day after reparations checks are dispersed, you will see the most creative and exploitative financial vehicles the world has ever seen, because we don't value some people in this country as much as we do others. And so those who receive these checks will be targeted by banks and mortgage companies and payday lenders, and I mean, you name it. There will be ways of trying to figure out how to redistribute the money that have been distributed via reparations to these households. So when activists say things like Black Lives Matter, this is not just about criminal justice. This is an assertive proclamation that Black people matter. They should be valued. And when you value things, you don't exploit them. When you value people, you don't exploit them. And so unless we close what Princeton professor Eddie Glaude calls the value gap, then the policy solutions to mitigate racism won't be sufficient to root it out, which is why this multiracial solidarity is not about closing economic gaps or racial disparities on socioeconomic factors, which, by the way, are important and I believe in, but it suggests that the root of the problem is a level beneath that. It's that we don't see each other as truly fellow citizens on equal footing, and that until we embrace one another in that way, that policy or leaders will either exploit it and policy will fall short, or until we demand that policy closes gaps, not to ensure equal outcomes, but to ensure equal opportunity and equal protection, and leaders would be responsive to a public who insists on this structure.
Yeah, fascinating. Now, I wonder if you could reflect on the timing of this book and writing this book. Published in 2021, I can imagine it's been in the pipeline for a bit through a time of a pandemic, a national unification around outrage, crimes against and violence against Black people. Can you talk about that and how it changed the writing of your book or informed the process or thinking for your next book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will admit that this book was supposed to be about the role that Black voters play in shaping the political futures of America. Um, and it is, and that was sort of a product of my dissertation that I finished in 2016. And I was going to turn the dissertation into a book to show the relationship between America's future and the way Black people vote and participate politically. And then in the fall of 2016, Hillary Clinton loses the election, which she would have won. If she had won, it would have been because of Black turnout and overwhelming support. But once Donald Trump wins, then the world's attention, and certainly the nation's attention, turns to white working class voters. And it's now Appalachia is the place of fascination, and white working class folks in the Deep South are a place of fascination. And Black voters were just of less interest in the publishing world. And so I expanded the thesis to suggest that there are lessons to take from the Black experience in America that we could apply to the nation in order to make a nation that's actually a more perfect union. I wrote the book. I pitched the book on this new proposal in late 17 into 2018. Fortunately found a publisher in 2018, and then I wrote the book between August of 2018 and I finished it in September of 2019. Turned in my manuscript. I wanted the book to come out in the summer of 2020. And my publisher said the summer of 2020 is going to be a very, very bad time for publishing. If you're a new author, especially because it's before a presidential election. And people are not going to be paying attention to optimism and hope and faith around race when they're at each other's throats to ensure their side wins. So let's wait till after the election. Let's wait till the nation sort of accepted the outcome. And then when they're looking for hope, we'll drop this book right in their lap. And then that sounded great. And then 2020 comes along. And in March, we're told to stay home, don't go grocery shopping, don't go to work, don't go to school. The economy collapses because of the pandemic. And then Ahmaud Arbery is killed by vigilantes in Georgia. Breonna Taylor is killed in Louisville. And George Floyd is killed on Memorial Day in a video of 9 minutes and 29 seconds for the world to see. And a summer of racial justice protests happen, that to the point where you have people like Republican Senator Mitt Romney tweeting Black Lives Matter as he participates in a racial justice protest in the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C., outside the White House, where a Republican president sits. This is unimaginable 5 years ago. Every day for weeks on end in every state in the union, there are Black Lives Matter protests or racial justice protests in places like Idaho, Vermont, Maine, Montana, where the white population is over 90%. There are racial justice protests across generations where not a single Black person is present. And so this was a moment where I wish I had been able to drop my book there and say, while the energy is here for how do we get past this problem, I have some ideas. And then we sort of come out of the presidential election happens. It's very contentious, accusations of fraud and election theft. And then the president is impeached for a second time. And then some folks storm the Capitol on January 6th. And whatever hope we felt in the summer of solidarity, the summer of 2020, I call it the summer of solidarity, felt like it had been erased out of after January 6th. And the political infighting became more entrenched. Things like the 1619 Project and critical race theory became central to the public discussion about race. And then my book comes out when where the knives are back out. And I still hope that for those that really want this country to work and believe we can mitigate the effects of racism, that they will turn to this book and share it and suggest we don't have to hate one another over differing approaches to ideas. There's actually a path forward out of this where we can all benefit from. And so here's to hoping that events like this and the stalwart Harvard community will be able to sort of get these ideas out to more folks, that we can help reshape the nation to be more aligned to the ideals that we hold in our hearts.
Oh, absolutely. And now, I can't help but use that as a perfect segue to talk about your time at Harvard a bit. Many of our participants may be here taking courses, working towards their degree right now. And many of us alumni have that shared understanding of just how hard that time was, how difficult of an education it was, but what benefits it reaped. Would you mind talking a little bit about that, sharing a bit about your time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was at the Extension School from 2008 until 2011. And frankly, I was still in the military at the time. I was a naval officer stationed in Newport, Rhode Island. And I was coming up on a promotion cycle, and I needed a master's degree to make me almost a shoe-in for a promotion. So I needed to be more competitive, and the master's degree would help me. And when I learned about the Extension School and that I could get a master's degree from Harvard, there was no question. It was a no-brainer that that's what I was going to do. And so for just about 3 years, I would finish up work in Newport, Rhode Island, and either drive to Providence and jump on the commuter train into South Station and then hit the T to Harvard Square, or I would drive from Newport up to Harvard Yard for classes twice a week on Harvard's campus. And it meant so much to me to be able to walk on campus, to learn from Harvard professors, to take on material that wasn't watered down, that wasn't made easier, that wasn't a money grab scheme to decide how can we make easy money off students that want the Harvard brand. It was a Harvard education. And I learned more from my professors and my classmates than I ever thought imaginable. I enjoyed being in Widener Library and getting drinks in Grindel's after class with my classmates more than I could. And this is as a mid-30s-year-old guy. I wasn't a college-age kid anymore. It was just so formative for me. Professionally, it worked. I was promoted and I ended up retiring as a commander in the Navy. I will also say that having Harvard on my resume helped me when I applied to the White House Fellowship that I ultimately received, certainly helped me in getting admitted into a doctoral program at Northeastern, also there in Boston. I absolutely believe it has helped me professionally in terms of getting access into many of the places where I've written for or rooms that I've been invited into. So I cannot overstate how much Harvard has meant to me. I can't, and how much it has meant, not just to my personal development, but to my professional development. The last thing I'll say on this, because I know we're kind of getting close, is that if I had done 20 years in the military and then gone to be a defense contractor, I probably could have succeeded based on my military career and a master's degree, probably from anywhere, and continue to live a very comfortable lifestyle. But I chose to completely reinvent myself when I left the military. I don't do anything related to national security now. I think specifically about race and electoral politics. And so at the age of 40, I decided to leave, or 42, I decided to leave everything I'd been doing professionally behind and become a scholar in this new thing. The confidence to do that, to take this leap of faith in my interests and abilities and talents, a formative part of that confidence was created there on Harvard Yard in classes via the Extension School. And so I have a second act to my professional career because of the Extension School, and I am forever grateful.
Wow. Well, here is to a third and a fourth act and a fifth and a sixth, because you have done some extraordinary things. And we are so grateful for you sharing this book and sharing your story and your hope and fulfilling that promise that you spoke about and first pages of your book. And thank you so much for your time. The Harvard community is vast and very strong and connected. And I know that you will find great partnership there as well, here at Harvard Extension, but Harvard-wide, in helping share this book, this story, this promise out. Really incredible. So thank you to everyone here for the wonderful questions and just for the great context and humanity that you've shared here, Ted. Just
thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
As I mentioned, this video will be completely captioned and hosted on Harvard Extension School's YouTube channel in perpetuity. So we will review it again and seek more resources. But in the meantime, Ted, keep in touch. Let us know how we can help you, and everyone, please come back again. All right. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.